Hi, I'm Gary Hunn, the Executive Director of the Mojave Desert Land Trust. We want to welcome all of you participating on Zoom and on the live streams, Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for joining us at this critical moment for the Western Joshua Tree and for taking an interest in its proposed listing under the California Endangered Species Act. It's an honor for MDLT to host this webinar tonight. We believe you will find your time well spent as we have brought together two experts in their respective fields on the Western Joshua Tree. They will be able to tell you why the Joshua Tree is so important, why it needs protection, and what you can do to help protect it. Our first presenter tonight is Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, Principal Climate Change Scientist for the National Park Service and Associate Adjunct Professor at UC Berkeley. Patrick will speak about human-caused climate change in Joshua Tree National Park and carbon solutions to help protect nature and human well-being. He is the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The science panel awarded a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He has authored the comprehensive report, Anthropogenic Climate Change in Joshua Tree National Park, California, USA. He has been honored with the Stephen T. Mather Award for the National Parks from the National Parks Conservation Association in 2019 and was named Pacific West Region Research Scientist of the Year by the National Park Service in 2017. Our second presenter this evening is Brendan Cummings. Brendan wrote the petition to list the Western Joshua Tree as a threatened species under CESA, the California Endangered Species Act. Brendan has a multi-decade career in environmental law. He began his career in private practice, specializing in environmental and civil rights litigation. He founded the Ocean Program with the Center for Biological Diversity and currently serves as CBD's Conservation Director. Brendan has litigated dozens of Endangered Species Act cases, including securing protection for extensive coastal habitat for polar bears in Alaska. After their presentations, we will have a Q&A. You can ask your questions here in the Zoom chat or in the comments sections of the live streams, and our team will put as many of those questions as possible to our panelists. So without further ado, I'll hand over the program to Patrick.
Great, can you see my screen? Just checking. Brendan, just nod if you can see my screen. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Gary, for the invitation, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in for your interest. Joshua Tree National Park was one of the first places I went 30 years ago when I first visited Southern California. Stepping out in the morning from my tent to the view of the Joshua trees under a blue sky created a stunning impression that I've remembered ever since. The Mojave Desert reminds me of the West African Sahel, where I conducted field research for my Ph.D. And I uncovered that anthropogenic, human-caused climate change had caused a massive die-off of trees across the West African Sahel. 1 in every 5 trees had died at the end of the 20th century, and 1 out of every 3 tree and shrub species had disappeared locally. And this was because of human-caused climate change, emissions half a world away, heating up the African Sahel, and causing the most severe drought in the global instrumental record. The southwestern United States, including the area of the Mojave Desert, is now experiencing one of the most severe droughts since the 15th century due to human-caused climate change. And of course, the great concern is the increased death and potentially local disappearance of Joshua Tree. So I'm going to be speaking about these issues for about 15 minutes in these 4 sections. And you can refer to the report that Giri mentioned in the introduction, and other scientific information that I'm going to present. There's the websites there, and my website at the bottom. You can download this report. Cars, power plants, deforestation, other human sources have or pump 11.5 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere each year. But oceans, forests, and other ecosystems can only naturally absorb about 6 billion tons. And so the rest accumulates in the atmosphere. And that's the fundamental imbalance that is causing climate change. And it's raised carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to its highest level in 800,000 years. Consequently, temperatures have increased around the world. This map it shows the results of research that published by colleagues and me. And it was the first research that examined climate change trends across all the national parks, now 419 national parks. And we found that climate change has exposed the US national parks to disproportionate increases in heat and aridity. And in fact, temperature has increased in the national parks has increased at twice the rate that it has in the 50 United States. In addition, and so when we zoom in, we see that in the Mojave, but particularly Joshua Tree, we see that this is one of the areas of greatest increase, and there are some areas around the park where temperatures increased more than 2 degrees Celsius per century. That's almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The average for the park as a whole is 1.5 degrees. This actually shows the trend on the bottom for the area within park boundaries, and then the weather station at 29 Palms. So a map of precipitation change over the past century shows that for a lot of the United States, precipitation rainfall has increased because climate change is essentially an input of energy into the atmospheric system, and it increases storms and it increases rainfall. But we see in the Southwest, and in particularly the area around Joshua Tree National Park, has experienced a statistically significant decline in precipitation, a decrease of 1/3 in this period, 1/3 per century. And this is that data. This shows the time series, that statistically significant decrease. And so this produces the arid environment that we know in the Mojave. The natural climate has produced the arid conditions, but anthropogenic climate change is increasing the severity of that aridity. Consequently, the species and ecosystems of the region are experiencing impacts. The canyon wren and other winter birds the ranges of them have shifted north across the United States, about 30 kilometers since 1975. And you see the graph there shows the data for the Audubon Christmas bird count circle that includes Joshua Tree National Park. That decrease of the canyon wren is a sign of its abundance moving north to follow the cooler weather. In addition, colleagues of mine at UC Berkeley have uncovered that climate change has reduced bird species richness 40% in Mojave National Preserve, in Joshua Tree National Park, Death Valley National Park, all the protected areas in the Mojave Desert part of California. So continued climate change places ecosystems at risk. This graph shows the results of 121 different climate models. And the horizontal axis here is the projected temperature change by the end of the century, 2100. That's temperature on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis is the precipitation change. So, so this is positive and this is negative. The black dot is today, 0, 0. And the 4 big dots are the averages of the models for the 4 different emission scenarios of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what this shows is that by the end of the century, the worst case for Joshua Tree National Park is an increase in annual average temperature of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. That's 8 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is astounding, right? And the good news is that if we reduce emissions from human activities and we meet the Paris Agreement goals, we can avoid getting to this red dot, and we can limit our warming to this green dot, which is 1 to 2 degrees Celsius increase. Those were the averages, but climate change has been disrupting the balance of the atmospheric system, and the projections under the worst case for Southern California by mid-century, by 2050, are an increase of hot days. That's days of 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit or more. An increase of a month or more per year, 30 to 40 more days, hot days per year. And then big rainstorms that occur right now approximately every 5 years, those doubling in frequency occurring every 2 to 3 years. Some of the consequences of this are a potential increase in wildfire in the Mojave. And this is a wildfire that occurred in Joshua Tree National Park. A lot of what is fueling the wildfire is an increase in red brome and other invasive grasses. Climate change favors the growth and spread of invasive species in 2 ways. One, a lot of these species exploit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere more efficiently than native species. So more carbon dioxide enhances the growth of many invasive species. In addition, the warmer and then sometimes moister conditions often favors species from Asia or from Europe that grow in areas that are currently hotter or have these moist periods that the Mojave doesn't. So this map actually shows, colleagues and I published this analysis of climate change and invasive species, and Joshua Tree is in the area of high vulnerability, of meeting the high vulnerability. And another vulnerability of Joshua Tree is that the young Joshua trees are sensitive to high temperatures and drought, in addition to fire, which I already showed. That's 3 potential risks under climate change for young and old Joshua trees: high temperatures, drought, and fire. Consequently, under high emissions, climate change increases the risk of Joshua tree death across 3/4 of its range. And in fact, 4 different research efforts have consistently found the risk of losing suitable climate for Joshua trees from Joshua Tree National Park. And I'm just going to go through this really briefly. Actually, you see in the dark text here is the projected increase in temperature, and here pink is unsuitable, here red is unsuitable, here things that are not black are unsuitable, and here that things that are not green are unsuitable. And consistently, the modeling that is based on Joshua Tree ecology and on observed relationships of the species to climate consistently show a risk of losing Joshua Tree here at the southern end of its range. And in fact, under the highest emission scenario, potential loss of all suitable climate. This is consistent with the millennia of shifting of the range of the species. We have fossil records that show Joshua Tree growing far south in California, far south in Arizona. None of these have been found in Mexico. This is inferred here. And so from 12,000 years ago, the end of the last glacial age, to today, temperatures globally have increased 4 degrees Celsius, so about 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And in that time, Joshua trees have, the range of it has retracted to the north, maybe 100 kilometers, maybe 300 kilometers. And that shows its sensitivity. This 4 degrees Celsius is at the low end of the worst case under human-caused climate change in the next century. So we see here the sensitivity of Joshua Tree. And so it keeps shifting north to follow the cooler temperatures. Of course, the National Park Service and other conservation agencies, we manage the entire ecosystem. Of course, we focus in on species of special concern, but we manage the entire ecosystem. That's why I was showing you the impacts on vegetation and on bird life, and climate change also threatens the desert tortoise. So it's not just the Joshua Tree, and we have very widespread potential impacts, even though the aridity of the region may increase. You have the potential for flash floods, for the rainfall being concentrated in fewer events. One of the ways in which the national park is responding to this has been using the scientific data to identify the potential refugia, or stable areas, the more stable areas for Joshua Tree, and strictly protecting them. And so the park has established fire breaks, is prioritizing invasive species removal, and protecting the refugia from unnecessary trampling and other disruptions. So getting towards the end here, I wanted to mention the solutions. I wanted to emphasize the solutions to this problem. And ecosystems naturally reduce climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the air and storing it in wood and leaves and other vegetation matter. And California hosts the ecosystem with the most dense ecosystem carbon in the world, the coast redwood, 2,600 tons per hectare, 10 times the density or the amount of carbon per square on the ground in Amazon rainforest. Colleagues and I produced the first analysis of these carbon densities across the state of California, because California is one of the few jurisdictions in the world with mandatory greenhouse gas reductions. And as part of that, the state asked us to quantify what have been the changes in ecosystems. And to give you an idea of this important service that ecosystems provide, the 27 national parks in California store the equivalent of 1 year of carbon emissions from people in Los Angeles and all of those other cities, over 7 million Americans. That might sound like a lot, but actually it's not, because it's only 1 year. So in 1 year, 7 million Americans burn the equivalent of all the carbon in the Joshua trees and in the coast redwoods and in the giant sequoias and in everything else in the national parks in California. So this points to that it's essential, that natural solutions are insufficient, and that it's essential that we reduce emissions from fossil fuel burning. And in the United States, even if the current administration has been attempting to suppress science and block action on climate change, California and 23 other states and Puerto Rico have banded together in the US Climate Alliance and have cut their greenhouse gas emissions 16%, on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And part of that is the wind farm that you all know between Palm Springs and Joshua Tree, and renewable and other forms of renewable energy, energy conservation, and energy efficiency. The state of California, we've actually cut our emissions enough that we met the state goal 4 years early, and we're continuing to cut our emissions. The Golden Gate National Recreation Area here in the San Francisco Bay Area has actually cut its emissions 30% in 5 years. And then they calculated the remaining emissions and they purchased offsets. They purchased methane recovery and efficiency units at dairy farms off-site. And so they reduced methane emissions by an amount equivalent to what the park was still emitting. And so they went carbon neutral. That's what big organizations are doing, but you can do your part. And I encourage you to do your part by walking, biking, taking public transit. When I go to Joshua Tree, and this was, of course, before the coronavirus, but I get there completely on public transit. In fact, I live a car-free life here at home, and I try to do that wherever I go. So billions and billions of small actions have created, small unsustainable actions have generated the problem of climate change. So billions and billions of positive, sustainable actions, however small, can help solve the problem of climate change and protect Joshua trees and all of our other natural wonders. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Pass to Brendan.
Patrick, if yes, can you give me the thumbs up? Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As noted, I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer, and part of what I do is take climate science and biological science and make sure our policies and our laws do as much as they can to protect our wildlife, our biodiversity, and our Joshua trees. And in that context, last October, I took all that climate science and other science that scientists like Dr. Gonzalez have put together and assembled this petition, which is a scientific and legal document. It's about 75 pages long, everything you want to know about Joshua trees and more. And you can find it on our website, which there's a link at the end. And that started a process that ultimately should get better protection for Joshua trees under state law. And I'm going to run through the process, the threats to Joshua trees, and then ultimately the consequences of this and how you can get involved. And you'll notice this petition refers to the Western Joshua tree. Joshua trees, we often use the phrase Joshua tree and to refer to a singular entity, which we think of as the Joshua trees inhabit 4 states, California, Arizona, Nevada, a little bit of Utah. They've long been recognized as 2 varieties, but really only in the past 15 years or so has it been recognized that there are in fact 2 distinct species of Joshua trees. How they differ and how that was found out could warrant a webinar all on its own. But the important point here is that the Western Joshua tree is these areas in green that you see on the map. That is the species we're trying to protect. And it's likely more imperiled than the Eastern species for 2 main reasons. One, a good chunk of its habitat is on private land that's not protected at all. And 2, because of the work of Dr. Gonzalez and his colleagues in the National Park Service, we have a lot more science on it. So we know what the threats are and what's going on. And this is very similar to the graph you just saw in his presentation. One thing to think about when we're looking at the status of a species today is what was it in the past? And in the deep past, as you've heard, it had a much larger range. And that range shrank dramatically with the warming. And the important thing to notice on top of that is it didn't expand very much at all. While lots of other species migrated further north or higher elevations, Joshua trees only moved a little bit. In other words, that reflects the fact that they don't really have very good dispersal or migratory abilities. And so as the climate warms at a rapid rate, left to their own devices, they are not going to be able to keep up with that change. The other thing when talking about how they are doing now, it's what were they like 200 years ago? Because the most famous Joshua trees in the world are in Joshua Tree National Park, we often think of that's where they are, that's where the biggest and healthiest ones have always been. But the Antelope Valley in California, which also no longer has antelope, the pronghorn antelope that gave its name, was home to a giant Joshua tree forest that included Joshua trees that are hard to comprehend their existence, as this photo shows. They were so much bigger than the largest Joshua trees we find today. Most people in California are aware that our giant redwoods are a shadow of what they once were, but relatively few folks know that we had a forest of giant Joshua trees as well. And what happened to the Antelope Valley Joshua trees? They were cut down, they were bulldozed, they were paved over. That area has developed rapidly, first with farms, then with towns that became cities. And even, as you can see in the western edge of the valley here, one of those sort of difficult ironies where renewable energy projects, which are essential to addressing climate change, in some cases have been poorly sited and then put in places where to build them, they cut down Joshua trees. So one of the things we're hoping to get out of this listing process is better land use planning to prevent this from happening everywhere in the range. So what are the current protections of the Western Joshua tree? I'm primarily going to talk about what's going on private lands or non-federal lands, because that's where California law is most impactful. And about 40% of the range of the Western Joshua tree is on private land. There is a state law that, in theory, protects Joshua trees. It's the California Desert Native Plants Act. But this law was largely designed to prevent what was known as like cactus poaching, people taking plants out of the desert and selling them commercially, which was a much bigger threat in the past and still remains a threat to some species. But it also includes some habitat protection measures, but the authority of it to implement it is delegated to the counties, who in turn can delegate it to local entities, and which are then enshrined in local ordinances, which should protect Joshua trees, but we find in practice they often do not. This is a picture I took about 10 days ago of a project site in Yucca Valley, California, which is a town adjacent to Joshua Tree National Park. And you'll see these Joshua trees, which are healthy adult Joshua trees, or were healthy adult Joshua trees, were either cut down or knocked over. And I thought, is this lawful? Is this legal? Should this get reported? And I dug up the permit for this. And what the permit that was issued for this project had in it was there were apparently 108 Joshua trees on the project site. The developer designed their project to avoid 2 of them. They did a survey of the Joshua trees and somehow determined that 42 of them were transplantable. Not sure why the others weren't, but that's what they determined. But then they only sought a permit for 23, which the permit said they were going to transplant them to a casino. And then the remainder were bulldozed or chainsawed, as near as we can tell. And that's just one project in one town. And a single project like that, as much as we don't like to see it, that's not an extinction level threat to the Western Joshua tree. But the species faces a death by 1,000 cuts if similar land use practices are carried out throughout its range. This map, which was prepared by the federal government, takes the range of the Joshua tree and projects over the coming century what habitat will be lost based on development trends as well as current land use protections. And what you see is the gray areas in this map are all the private lands within the range of the Joshua tree that are projected to be lost over this century if they're not otherwise protected by law. And if that happens, Joshua Tree National Park down here in the southeast becomes an ecological island. Edwards Air Force Base becomes another island, and all of this would be lost. If Joshua trees are to survive the very difficult decades ahead of them due to climate change and other threats, we cannot allow that level of development to occur in their range. So what are the threats to the species? As you've just heard, climate change. And climate change is the preeminent threat. And I'm going to address that less than I would otherwise because Dr. Gonzalez has talked a lot about it. I'm also going to address fire and invasive grasses, which are a significant and growing threat, and we've talked about development. For all of these threats, the life history traits of the Joshua tree make them particularly vulnerable. So, quick history, or natural history of the Joshua tree. They can live upwards of 300 years, maybe more, but average life expectancy, 90 years, usually less than 100. They grow slowly, 3 centimeters a year on average, but highly variable, which that means they can have no growth in 3 years and spurt up 10 centimeters in a year if it's good rain. One study showed that they have to be at least 1 meter tall and usually 2 or 3 meters tall and at least 30 years old before they flower for the first time. And they flower only in certain years. But if you think of, if you planted a Joshua tree today and nurtured it and somehow it survived to 2050 when it was first ready to flower, we'll be living in a very different climate by then. A Joshua tree requires pollination by a moth. It requires seed dispersal by rodents, and fewer than 1% of seeds actually produce seedlings. And once you're a seedling, you're still not out of the woods. You only survive as a seedling if you're under a shelter of a host plant. And one study following a long-term study plot of Joshua trees documented 80% seedling mortality over 22 years. So what does all this mean? As the author of that study said, the alignment of all these factors likely results in successful establishment of new seedlings only a few times in a century. So Joshua trees, even without development, without fire, without climate change, are already leading a somewhat difficult existence. But that reproduction works if we give them the space and they can successfully reproduce. This photo I took less than 2 months ago in Joshua Tree on a parcel owned by the Mojave Desert Land Trust, where a fire burned through, apparently started by a careless cigarette. And one thing this highlights is that even lands that are formally protected, that we think are free from the threat of development, still face other threats and need management and other activities to protect them. And it also means that the areas we set aside to protect Joshua trees have to be larger, because even some of our best protected areas will get damaged. This is a photo taken nearby shortly before the fire. And this is one of those photos that, to me, the more I learn about Joshua trees, on some level, knowledge destroys beauty. The Joshua trees are beautiful, but in between all the Joshua trees, you see this carpet of grass. That grass is a non-native grass, schismus, that since its establishment has greatly increased the likelihood of large fires in the range of Joshua trees. This is a fire-killed Joshua tree in the national park, laying in a bed of red broom, another invasive grass. This is an area that 20 years ago was a thriving Joshua tree woodland, and now feels like it's mostly a non-native grassland. But not every area is that way yet. There are still some areas that are relatively pristine without invasive grasses. This is another parcel that the Land Trust owns with some healthy young Joshua trees, healthy native bunch grasses. We need to identify these parcels, places like this, and have the Land Trust or other entities protect them. So why is there more native grass and more fire? Well, the invasive grasses generally follow disturbance. They came in with cows, they come in with vehicles, they come in along roads and power line right-of-ways. But one other thing that contributes to them coming in is they're getting fertilized. Desert soils are naturally somewhat nutrient poor, but nitrogen, which comes in from smog, from tailpipes and smokestacks blown in from LA, and to some degree also from agriculture, from fertilizers, blows in from the coast, rains out, and deposits in the desert, and is acting to fertilize these grasses, allowing them to outcompete native plants. If you look at this slide, pretty much anywhere that's not blue in the slide has elevated levels of nitrogen, including most of the range of the Western Joshua tree. Now, one hopeful point is the same threat of nitrogen deposition that leads to invasive grasses that leads to more fires. Solving that helps with climate change. It comes from our smokestacks and tailpipes. If we electrify our vehicle fleet, if we convert our gas-fired power plants to solar, wind, and other renewables, we can cut down the level of nitrogen deposition, and that can give us hope in the long term of better addressing the invasive grasses. So what about fires? This is a map of fires over a 20-year period, 1990 to 2010. And the important thing here, fire has increased dramatically. In 2005, a larger more area burned in the Mojave than in the past 25 years combined, fueled by these grasses. 90% of fires in the Mojave are human caused. And you can intuit that from this map because it's pretty clear that the freeways show up, Interstate 10, 15, and 40. But the most important and the most concerning thing about this, where is the greatest concentration of fires in the Mojave? That band of mid-elevation areas, which is the key habitat area for the Western Joshua tree. So what happens to Joshua trees when they burn? Well, lots of studies have looked at this. And as this one sums up, they may survive the burning, but they probably die. And one study carried out in the park, looking at this, it found 80% of the trees in its survey area that burned were dead within a few years. And looking at other studies, the range was between 64 and 95% mortality. So individual Joshua trees may survive a fire, but overall, the number of trees in it and ultimately is a source of decline that is already underway. And what does it mean long term? Well, it can take decades or centuries for a Joshua tree woodland to grow back after a fire. And that assumes that a stable environment. But it's not a stable environment because we've changed the climate and we've changed the fire cycle. So it's quite possible some of these areas will never have Joshua tree woodlands again. So climate change. You saw similar slides already. The key thing to note is climate change is already here. 15 years ago, when I was doing talks and legal work to protect polar bears, we were largely talking about climate change as a future threat to the species. But for Joshua tree in the California desert, climate change has arrived. It's already warmed our environment, and the desert area is warming faster than the rest of the United States, as you can see in this map. And that warming is not just an average, but it's felt in multiple different ways. Daily maximum temperatures will go up. And one of the things, and I'll focus on this one because you'll see it in another study, daily maximum temperatures can increase by over 3 degrees Celsius by 2039. This is from a 2005 baseline. So 20 years from now. And one of the studies looks at 3% increase in maximum temperature as the worst case scenario. But that, under certain scenarios, can only be 20 or 30 years away. We've seen precipitation. That's a lot less clear, but the take home is more variability. The droughts will be more intense and longer. The wet years will be more intense and wetter. And even if we get more winter rain, which in general would be a good thing, that winter rain tends to foster more invasive grasses, which then leads to more frequent and more intense fires. So over the past decade or so, again, you've seen these studies, there's been some in the previous talk, there's been a lot of studies on what climate means for Joshua trees. And I'm gonna look back at those from a slightly different lens from Dr. Gonzalez. So these 3 studies are the ones I'll talk about. The Cole et al. Study from 2011 looked at Joshua trees across their 4-state range. So not as 2 species, but as a singular entity, and concluded 90% loss of Joshua trees. But important for Western Joshua trees, if you look at their range, the area in red here, it's almost complete loss of Joshua trees. And the areas that are in green are not areas where Joshua trees will survive. Those are areas where suitable habitat might appear. So Joshua trees will only get there if we put them there, which raises a whole host of issues. So this was really the first, well, there were multiple studies before this, but this is the first one that focused so clearly on Joshua trees and painted such a dire picture for them, particularly in the western portion of their range. This is the 2012 studies by Cam Barrows was involved. And the important take home from this, they did a model. This shows the model for adult Joshua trees. And the model showing adult Joshua trees, remember a Joshua tree that's adult today came into the population in a climate that was about 1 degree C cooler than it is today. They did a similar model for juvenile Joshua trees. And the model for juvenile Joshua trees was very close to 1 degree hotter than the current model. What does that mean? When we look at a Joshua tree landscape in the national park, we see there's Joshua trees there, and we conclude the climate must be good for Joshua trees. But if you look at where Joshua trees are reproducing, depending on how you measure it, that's between 1/3 and 1/2 the size of where it's suitable for Joshua trees currently. In other words, if in that hypothetical world we could stop all warming today, we would still lose 1/3 to 1/2 of our Joshua trees as the current adults grow older and die out and are replaced by the younger trees. And obviously we're not stopping climate change today, so it's going to get worse before it gets better. The Lynn Sweet study that was described paints an even more dire picture, and I think what this one shows, this was similar methodology, but with more detail. And the more detail we get, the more information we get, the more dire it looks. And so under the higher range scenarios, which unfortunately the world is closer to than the more optimistic scenarios, we almost entirely lose Joshua trees from the national park. And coming back to the buzzkill of fire, even the areas that are supposed to most likely to survive climate change are the areas that have the highest levels of invasive grasses and are therefore the most fire prone. This map shows the refugee area, the areas that were well protected, and how they burned. So it's a pretty bleak future for Joshua trees. How are we doing on climate change as a society globally? Not very well. This is yesterday's CO2 measurements compared to a year ago. It's gone up 4.5 parts per million, a little over 1%. It's continuing to go up. Even if California may be on a good trajectory, actual atmospheric CO2 levels are not. Again, this slide, a lot going on, but the gist of it is, if we're going to keep to climate Paris targets, or even more moderate targets, we need to reduce our emissions drastically over this decade. So, with all those risks mentioned and highlighted, is the Western Joshua tree a threatened species? The definition under state law of a threatened species is, although not presently threatened with extinction, is likely to become an endangered species in the foreseeable future. In other words, you'll hear opponents of protection saying, they're still abundant, they're still widespread, they're not at imminent risk of extinction, therefore they shouldn't be protected. But state law, by definition, a threatened species is one where you are forward-looking. What can we do now to protect them so they never reach that stage of imminent endangerment? What is the path to CESA protection? This lists out all the various steps in the process. Needless to say, there's a few steps. Most importantly, coming up next month, August 20th, the California Fish and Game Commission, which is a politically appointed body, will vote on whether to advance Joshua trees to the next stage in the process, called candidacy, at which point they will receive certain legal protections. That's what we're focused on, with more permanent protection likely to not occur till a year later. What are the consequences? There are quite a few. I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to try to just whiz through these quickly. Policy of the state to conserve them. It's policy of the state to acquire lands for habitat for these species. So that'll help efforts of the Land Trust and other entities to buy up and preserve land for Joshua trees. Conservation mandate for state agencies. So state parks, Caltrans, the Energy Commission, and others have to take conservation into consideration in their decisions. The Department of Fish and Wildlife would do a recovery plan, which will be a blueprint for what do we need to do to save Joshua trees. There's also prohibitions. One set of prohibitions applies to agencies. They cannot approve projects that would jeopardize a listed species or destroy or modify essential habitat. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't approve projects that will harm individual trees. This is the species scale list. Will this push them towards extinction? They're prohibited from that. There are separate provisions that prohibit the killing of individuals. This is the one most relevant for Joshua trees. This would prohibit, unless there's a permit or exception, an activity that is likely to kill a Joshua tree. So what are the exceptions? There's a lot of them. It quickly gets into legalese, so I'm going to blaze through these, and you can, I'm happy to share this information for anyone who's really interested in the legal minutia. But there are exceptions for scientific, educational, and management purposes. So anyone wanting to do restoration work, science work, education, that's easy enough to get an exemption for. Then take can also be authorized if the take is incidental to otherwise lawful activity. You'll hear the phrase incidental take permit. But this, to get such a permit, you have to minimize and fully mitigate it. So that example I showed you of 108 Joshua trees where only 2 were avoided, that probably doesn't meet the conservation standard of CESA. More protection of Joshua trees would be required to issue a permit to remove them. Another thing to note, the Joshua tree shares a lot of its habitat with the desert tortoise. The desert tortoise has been protected under state law for 30 years. In theory, a lot of the entities that are bulldozing Joshua tree habitat should be getting permits for the take of desert tortoise. Most of them are not. Why not? It's kind of hard to see a desert tortoise unless you're up close and on the property. And my experience is developers never seem to find tortoise on their property. In contrast, Joshua trees, if listed, will likely be the first species that you can tell if they're on a property, the first threatened species that you can tell definitively whether they're on the property by going on Google Maps and looking at the satellite photos or the aerial photos. And therefore, what happens to them? Land use decisions that kill Joshua trees, that remove Joshua trees, cannot happen in secret. They can be viewed by all. And that's important. And if we have public scrutiny of what's going on, I believe we will have better decision-making, which ultimately will protect more Joshua trees. The path forward, there's a process called the Natural Communities Conservation Plan, which is a large-scale land use plan that protects not just Joshua trees, but the whole suite of species in the area. These have been done by 14 entities in California. Many counties have them. The Coachella Valley on the south side of the national park has done it and has a very functional one. The desert communities have not, and they should. And I'm hoping that the Joshua tree listing, if we see it, will compel them to do so, something they should have done 30 years ago with the desert tortoise, but hopefully the Joshua tree will lead to that. Finally, the CESA listing process requires that a petition contain recommendations of how to save the species. And those are listed in our petition. I won't read them for you now, but it's a whole range of activities that are both protecting habitat, managing habitat, dealing with invasive species. And lastly, is there hope? Like for some species threatened by climate change, really the only thing we can do to save them is to reduce our emissions. But Joshua trees, there's a lot we can do in the interim. We absolutely have to address emissions, but the species is long-lived. Adults are relatively resilient. They have a pretty wide range, and some are in protected areas that are well managed, like our national park. If we do what's necessary, we protect those that are there, we prevent fire risk, we possibly aid them with head-starting juveniles or do other things of that sort. And if on top of that, we as a society get it together to reduce our emissions, over the next 2 or 3 decades, where it'll get warmer no matter how good we are on our emissions, we can get Joshua trees through that rough trajectory and then help them survive the coming decades. So what can you do? Most immediately, the California Fish and Game Commission. That's coming up August 20th. There'll be lots of information circulated on MDLT's website, my organization's website, of how you can do that. A lot of other things you can do. Much of the science on this has been done by citizen science volunteers. Contact the National Park or MDLT to figure out how to do that. Most importantly, demand your politicians enact meaningful climate policies or land use policies. And thank you.
Thank you, Patrick and Brendan, for those comprehensive and excellent presentations. We really appreciate it. We now would like to put some questions to you from the viewers, and I'm going to hand over the program to our Communications Director, Jessica Dacey.
Hi. Great. So we have a couple questions that have come in on the climate change issue. I'll just throw those out to both of you. Are there any initiatives to cultivate and plant Joshua trees to help the reproduction of the species? Is a first question, though.
To my knowledge, the National Park is not doing that. We're focusing on conserving the natural populations, particularly the climate change refugia.
Yeah, my understanding is similar. that there is some growth of them for restoration activities and things of that sort, but not on a large scale for reintroductions or assisted migration. And we're not advocating that that happen immediately, but we're advocating that that be studied and built into a recovery plan to see if it's viable, and if so, where, and how to do it in a way that's makes the most sense.
Okay. A question from Katie Jo Turk. Didn't Trump pull us out of the Paris Agreement? What is the country doing to achieve those Paris Agreement goals? And what can I do to help as an individual?
Okay, so the United States is still a party to the Paris Agreement until through 2021, through January 2021. He announced the intention to pull the United States out of it. What I highlighted was the U.S. Climate Alliance of 24 U.S. states and Puerto Rico who have pledged to meet the Paris Agreement goals and are actually on track to do that. What you can do as an individual is everything that I had in my last slide. Live sustainably, walk, bike, take public transit, and use energy efficient appliances and fixtures in your home, recycle. All of those things contribute to reducing the national greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, and I would echo that, and political action. Like, politicians only enact the right policies if they feel pressure from you to do it, and only if the right politicians are elected to enact those policies. So we need our individual action, but we need societal action to change our infrastructure to make it low carbon.
Thanks. Andrew Chambers asks, are there any IPM treatments being applied to Joshua Tree National Park or adjacent public land areas to prevent the spread of invasive annuals such as B, and I'm going to say this wrong, Madridensis rubens?
Bromus madridensis, variety of rubens. That's another name for the red brome that we were talking about. So the invasive plant management team for the National Park Service has been trying to control invasive plants through all of the Mojave Desert National Parks. So they do use integrated pest management. Regrettably, that does include pesticide application. It would definitely be more sustainable if it were completely biological control. But yes, they're actually hard at work. And one of the for Joshua Tree, those refugia have been prioritized for invasive species control.
Thank you. Andre Sanchez asks, could you clarify the role of how private lands can protect Joshua trees?
Yeah, I would say, a Joshua tree doesn't know whether it's in a national park or on private land or in a state park. And what we need to do is patch together a network of connected areas across the range of the species. And for a good chunk of its range, the only option we can do that on is private land. And so there's two ways of doing that. Acquisition, things that MDLT does of acquiring land. And two, policies that ensure that to the degree development happens in areas with Joshua trees, it's done in a way as sensitive as possible, that Joshua trees are protected, as many as possible, and that young Joshua trees are allowed to grow. All too often, what we see in developed areas, they'll scrape it clean but leave 3 adult Joshua trees, but no reproduction ever occurs. And once those trees age out, that's the end of Joshua trees on those lands. So we need a continuum from the completely protected to the better managed. And one of the reasons for that is the Joshua tree relies upon a yucca moth to pollinate. So there will be no Joshua tree seeds without that moth. And we do not know what densities of Joshua trees we need to maintain moth populations. And so if, say, Yucca Valley is to maintain an effective corridor for moths as migrating northward, we want to maintain high enough Joshua tree density in Yucca Valley, even scattered amidst the development.
Okay, I guess a follow-up question to that would be from Gloria Putnam. I'm a private landowner with big, healthy stands of Joshua trees on my ranch in the northern border of the ANF. What's the best way for private landowners to help protect Joshua trees? Is there any effort to organize like-minded landowners making up that 40% of privately held land habitat?
I'm not aware of such efforts, but there should be, and that sounds like a great thing for people interested to self-organize. And I think a lot of the work MDLT does in terms of education and conservation work could foster that. But you know, the most important things, don't destroy them. If you're going to sell your land, add a conservation easement to it. Sell or donate a conservation easement on those Joshua trees to a land trust such as MDLT or Transitions Habitat, which works out in the Antelope Valley. There's lots of things. And my hope is that once we have a regional planning process underway through an NCCP, there will be incentives to landowners to preserve Joshua trees. So larger developments will pay development fees, which then can go to either buy conservation easements on landowners like that, the person who asked the question, to incentivize the protection. There's a whole litany of things we can do, recognizing, you know, private land is private land. You know, it's not going to get seized and put into a state or national park. It's has to be managed in a way to meet all of our needs. And I truly believe we can do that in a way that protects Joshua trees.
Thank you. Minor Garcia asked, does the new legislation, the Great American Outdoors Act, help in achieving endangered status for the Joshua tree?
I would hope it, on some level, does the opposite, in that it can help prevent it becoming more endangered. Mainly, it's a funding mechanism, and much of the funding goes to the national parks, of which I'm sure Patrick can talk more about what it would be used for there. But it also frees up money for land acquisition. And so acquiring private lands to add them to the preserve networks, to grow our state parks, to connect our state parks, to build buffers around the national parks, the money from that bill could definitely help in that.
Okay. Another question, how is an likely to kill a Joshua tree defined, and who makes that decision on an individual basis?
Killing is a pretty straightforward thing, and then it'll be determined by the Department of Fish and Wildlife based upon what's known about the science of the species. So obviously, chainsawing one, that pretty much, I would say that's pretty indisputably would, if you do that without a permit, that's a violation. You know, pouring gasoline on the roots of one, probably. You know, trimming a branch that overhangs your house carefully, probably not. It's a continuum, and I think as this proceeds through the process, enough people will ask these questions and there'll be a recurrence of similar patterns that the department will probably set out guidelines for how to operate around Joshua trees to best protect them.
Annie Rocks asks, what other threats are there to Joshua trees? Are subterranean termites an issue? Is the woodpecker an issue? And what is the main cause that a Joshua tree just breaks down in the middle and falls over and dies?
Patrick, you want to take that one, or?
The very last one, it's very possible, although no rigorous research has been done. But I'm a forest ecologist, and I've seen a lot of dead Joshua trees. The drought, just the lack of water, is the main cause of tree mortality worldwide, globally. Now, Joshua tree is actually not a tree; it's a yucca, but it has a tree form. And the ones that I've seen since in the area of the national park, annual precipitation has fallen 32%, or by 1/3 in a century. That is a very substantial. Decrease. I would suspect that drought is often the cause of those dead Joshua trees that you see. I don't think woodpeckers would cause enough damage to kill a Joshua tree. And I am actually not sure about the prevalence of termites in the Mojave, but definitely in wetter areas, termites cause substantial tree death.
Okay, Casey Kiernan asks, can Joshua trees be moved?
There's two different, I'm not sure if that's the question of can they be moved as a matter of physics and botany, and the answer is yes, very carefully. With the right tools, a tree spade, Joshua trees can be successfully relocated, if done carefully. In the past, there are many areas where along highways where Caltrans or the feds did Joshua tree relocation, and they're just sort of like vertical cemeteries of dead trees. But in the national park, where the Park Service has had a lot of practice and has figured it out, there's a pretty good survival rate when they have to move them around for infrastructure. So it can be done. It just has to be carefully done. Would it require a permit? Probably. It already requires a permit under the existing California Desert Native Plant Act or your local equivalent of that. So it would probably also require a permit under CESA. And
I would add that while protecting an individual Joshua tree is important, even more important is the recruitment and growth and protection of small Joshua trees that others will enjoy in decades to come.
Good, thank you. Mike Sims asks, what's the best possible solution for non-native grasses?
Well, I guess, Brendan, you're leaving that to me. The non-native invasive grasses are extremely difficult to eradicate, but the general approach is either to mechanically move them, to remove them by hand completely in a contiguous area, so not doing a little patch here and a little patch there, but clearing out an entire patch. A lot of the control is done with herbicides, which have a lot of environmental impacts on their own, and so are not sustainable. But mechanical removal by hand, and so you remove a continuous patch and you just keep moving that frontier out, and then you try to prevent introductions. So. As Brendan mentioned, a lot of that just takes a ride on people's boots, on vehicle tires, and so areas where this is taken very seriously, areas are blocked off from human and from vehicular traffic. So yeah, that's the general approach. It's much easier to actually just prevent them from appearing in the first place. And so the invasive plant management teams often scout out, and if they see little tufts of invasive species, they'll attack those first to prevent the spread.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And because of the studies that show linkages to disturbance, land management policies, and this is more relevant on federal lands, that limit the number of unnecessary routes. So vehicles are not driving all over the place, but are in relatively confined channels. Over the past 2 decades, most of the cattle grazing on public lands in the range, this was driven by desert tortoise, but also in the range of the Joshua tree, cows have been largely, they're a big spreader of invasive things, so minimizing disturbance.
Thank you. Greg Vara asks, why are local ordinances such as in Yucca Valley allowing for old growth, such as Joshua trees over 15 foot, to be chainsawed or bulldozed?
Yeah, good question. The state law that was written as a backstop, as I said in my presentation, was designed, is the outgrowth of laws from the 1920s and 1930s when there was a big surge of cactus poaching. And so they were designed to prevent the commercialization of desert plants being taken from our wildlands. But the provisions that they have to protect habitat are pretty broad brush and require local city councils and planning agencies to enact ordinances that are protective enough and to actually enforce those ordinances. And every place we've looked, that doesn't seem to, they're not adequately protecting. And that's one thing that I think CESA listing of Joshua trees will create a secondary protection level at the state level that will hopefully change how local jurisdictions treat their permitting decisions with Joshua trees.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions are specific about Joshua Tree National Park. If either of you can answer them. What is the National Park doing to combat destructive behaviors of tourists to the park?
Well, that is not my area, but I hope that everybody can take part in discouraging vandalism and just indiscriminate cutting of Joshua trees and everything else that abuses public resources. They belong to all of this. I know this is a major concern, and actually the park regrettably needs to dedicate a lot of its time to defending from physical vandalism and take that time away from conservation. The park and the law enforcement in the park actually spend a lot of time on that, regrettably. So hopefully people who visit the park, and if you see something, you can try and discourage people from doing that just simply by talking and pointing it out in a non-confrontational way.
Okay. A question from Christina S. Brendan, can you elaborate on the one-year study under CDFW and the protection during this time? I understand that during the study, the Joshua tree will be protected for the year of the study. Yucca Valley's Planning Commission is telling their constituents that it will be more than likely 2 years rather than 1 year.
Okay. Yeah. So if come August 20th, we get the vote that we hope we get that advances the species to candidacy, interim protections kick in. The most important one is the prohibition against killing. All the permits and exceptions can apply, so you can get permits during that window. During that window, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the expert agency with the scientists, does a deeper review and they solicit all the scientific information out there, all the public comment, and make a recommendation as to whether protection under the Act, whether it truly meets the definition of a threatened species. They have a year to do it. They make that report, present it back to the Fish and Game Commission, and the Commission votes on it. Because the Commission meets every 2 months, the department has a year to do it. They usually take their full year. I've seen the final vote from candidacy to final decision in under a year for some species, but usually I would say a year plus at least 2 months, maybe a year and a half. I think a species like the Joshua tree, because it has a relatively large range and it's caught a lot of public attention, including from people who do not want to see it protected, that the department will treat it expeditiously, and the commission will do so as well. So I don't think it'll be 2 years. I think it'll be a year and a half max, probably just over a year.
Okay. Thank you. A follow-up question from Deborah Savit. What are the rules developers must follow, and are they very expensive and or difficult, especially in relation to the California Fish and Game Commission? Yucca Valley Town Council states that it will be too expensive, but they also claim the Joshua trees have triple protection. Can you clarify?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, the easiest way to do a development project that doesn't require a permit is to avoid killing Joshua trees. And many people who live up here in the high desert, like I do, build their houses in that manner or plan their things to avoid killing Joshua trees. But assuming that a project requires removal of Joshua trees, you need a permit. And there's multiple levels it can happen on. And one of the things, once we have a plan in place, which the high desert and Yucca Valley should have a plan, but they don't because they walked away from it years ago for tortoise. But for communities like the Coachella Valley, Palm Springs, Palm Desert, that have this regional plan in place, a developer pays a small fee for most housing things. It's about in the range of $100 or $1,000, and it goes up for a larger project. And as long as they check the boxes of complying with the conservation requirements, they don't need a separate permit because their local government got the permit for everyone. And all you have to do is comply with that rule. That's the model that works the best for people because the burden doesn't fall on the individual homeowner or landowner. Much of Southern California has done that. The high desert communities in San Bernardino County came close to getting such a large-scale permit a decade or so ago based on the desert tortoise, but they walked away from it at the last minute based on the calculation that it required more conservation than they wanted and that the department was unlikely to actually enforce it. And that bet paid off. We've seen all these desert communities sprawl with no permits for killing tortoise. Yucca Valley used to be full of desert tortoise. Now, where did they all go? Were they all avoided while all those projects went in? I don't know. So, long way of saying, there will be a permit process. If your local government doesn't step up and do it for you, then it'll fall on the individual property owner. But the best way to make it cheap and efficient and ultimately work best for you as well as the quality of your community as well as the ecology of the area and the Joshua tree is to push your local government to seek either a town-wide, regional-wide, or county-wide permit through the NCCP planning process.
Thank you. One more general question, and then another one just specifically about the listing. How many types of invasive species are found within the park?
Many. The major ones are red brome and Sahara mustard, but the website of the park actually has a list of all of the species in the park, and it's a lot of species.
Thank you. Jessica Milan asks, I currently live in Palmdale in the Antelope Valley. Who would be the best to reach out for political action?
I wish I had that answer off the top of my head. Obviously, you're, the town council and the county. Well, that's Palmdale's LA County, I believe. So LA County as well. Yeah, save that question and I'll try to, my contact information is there and I'll try to get a better answer for you and put you in touch with activists who work in that area who would know that answer off the top.
Okay.
But short answer for everyone is write a letter to the California Fish and Game Commission advocating protection of the Joshua trees, and that will advance it statewide, which means your local government will then it'll force them to confront the issue.
Thank you. And we will share that contact information at the end. And I guess a final question then, what are the reasons that people may not want to see the Joshua Tree protected?
You want that, Patrick, or should I give it a try?
No, I would say you would need to ask those people. We've been speaking about all the reasons that we would like to see it protected. It is one of the most important species in that part of the Mojave Desert, and an important part of the natural and cultural heritage of Southern California.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there was a recent LA Times article about Joshua Tree protection, and a person connected to real estate consortium in the area said something to the effect of, we love Joshua trees, but not if they get in the way of economic development. So I think that pretty much sums up the attitude of those who oppose protection. And I think it's a false dichotomy that protecting Joshua trees will actually improve not just the ecology, but the economy of our area, particularly around Joshua Tree National Park, which is a tourism-dependent economy where people come here to see Joshua trees, not to see bladed yards and the carcasses of Joshua trees piled up along the roadsides.
Yeah, I agree. As a final thought, that conservation of Joshua Tree on private lands outside of the park is certainly compatible with many forms of development in the area, and it doesn't preclude. It actually enhances the environment and enhances the reasons that people want to live in the Mojave Desert.
Thank you. Gary?
Okay. Well, first I want to thank our distinguished panelists, Patrick and Brendan. This has really been fantastic. And thank you once again, all those of you that are watching and participating. Don't forget to take action. And before, we're gonna put up a reminder, but real quickly, I just wanted to add that I'm a former land manager that was involved in the control of invasive exotic plants. And a few of the other things that are used are biological controls. Scientists look for insects and pathogens in countries where these plants are from that could be introduced to control them, that would not threaten native species. In some places, targeted grazing is used. In some places, well-timed prescribed burns are used. It's a little more difficult in the desert to do that, but where I worked in the Inland Empire, there are places where land managers have eliminated the non-native grasses, largely eliminated them, and returned the native ephemeral forbs. So there is hope, and we can't give up, and it certainly will help the Joshua Tree if we accomplish that. So, so again, thank you both, and everybody, please don't forget to take action. So here's a reminder of what you can do and where to write. And if you need extra help and advice, please get in touch via the emails on the screen. And thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.